Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today, you guessed it, into intentional listening. We're going to explore the core ideas from Laura Lewonder's new book, The Practice of Intentional Listening. It actually launches tomorrow on Amazon.
Yes, it does. Super exciting. And it's interesting because so many people are trying to improve their communication skills, but the listening part often gets overlooked.
Yeah, totally. It's like we assume we already know how to listen, but this book, it really challenges that assumption.
Right. And Laura Lewonder, she really gets into it in the introduction. She talks about how in today's world, with all the distractions, true listening has become like a lost art.
It's true. And in the book, she argues that this has some pretty serious consequences, like breakdowns in relationships, conflicts at work,
Hmm.
even like societal polarization.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. And she illustrates this point with a story about a friend who was struggling with a major life decision.
Yes. And the friend didn't want advice or solutions. They just needed someone to really listen.
Right. Just a safe space to process their emotions. It's a good reminder that sometimes the best way to support someone is to just be fully present and listen without judgment. It's not about fixing. It's about understanding.
Exactly. And that brings us to the big question. What exactly is intentional listening?
Yeah, that's a good question. What is it?
Well, in chapter 1, she defines it as giving your full attention, free from distractions, judgments, or the urge to jump in with your own thoughts. It's about being in the moment with the other person.
Okay, so how is that different from just hearing someone talk? I mean, I hear people all the time, but I'm not always really listening. You know what I mean?
Exactly. That's where the 4 pillars of intentional listening come in. Laura outlines these in chapter 1: presence, empathy, curiosity, and validation. These are what take you from just hearing to really listening.
I see. So it's not just about your ears. It's about engaging your mind and your heart to truly understand the other person.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And in chapter 2, she digs into the science of how our brains actually process listening. It's fascinating. Different parts of our brain are involved. The auditory cortex processes the sounds, and then areas like the limbic system help us interpret emotions and the nuances of tone.
Wow. So it's a much more complex process than we might realize.
It is, but here's the thing. Our brains like to be efficient, so they often try to take shortcuts when we listen.
Oh, no. What kind of shortcuts?
Well, things like zoning out, planning our responses while the other person's still talking, or filtering information through our own biases.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely been guilty of that, especially the part about planning my response before they're even done talking.
It happens to everyone. Laura calls these barriers to intentional listening, and in chapter 3, she identifies 6 common ones.
6. Wow. Let's hear about one, maybe one that a lot of people struggle with.
Okay, how about emotional reactivity? It's a big one.
Okay, that's a good one. It makes sense because we were just talking about providing a safe space for others to process their emotions. So I'm guessing this has to do with our own emotions getting in the way.
Exactly. You see, there's this part of the brain called the amygdala, and it plays a key role in processing emotions. And when we hear something that triggers a strong emotional response in us, the amygdala can basically take over.
So it's like if someone's saying something that makes us upset, we might stop really listening and instead just get defensive or start planning our comeback.
Exactly. Laura gives some great advice on how to handle this, like taking a mindful pause to calm down before you respond. She also talks about recognizing your personal triggers, those topics that tend to set you off. If you know what they are, you can be more prepared for difficult conversations.
That's a really good point. I know I've been in situations where I let my emotions take over, and it definitely made it harder to listen.
Mm.
Knowing my triggers and having some strategies in place would have been so helpful.
Absolutely. It takes practice, like building a muscle. The more you practice, the better you get at navigating tough conversations.
That makes sense. And it's funny because in chapter 2, when Laura was talking about the brain science, I was thinking about those mirror neurons.
Oh, yes. Mirror neurons. Those are fascinating.
They're the ones that fire both when we do something and when we watch someone else doing the same thing, right?
That's right. And they're really important for empathy. When we listen to someone with intention, our mirror neurons fire as if we're experiencing those emotions ourselves.
Wow, that's amazing. So just by listening, we're actually strengthening our capacity for empathy.
That's the power of it. And that brings us to the next step. How do we become more present and become better intentional listeners?
That's what I want to know. I'm already inspired to level up my listening skills, but I need some practical advice. I bet that's what part 2 of the book is all about.
You bet. Laura gives us a whole toolbox of techniques and strategies in part 2. It's good stuff.
I can't wait. This is getting really exciting.
Me too. It's game-changing stuff, for sure. So are you ready to put all this into practice? Part 2 of the book is where Laura really gets into the how-to of becoming a better intentional listener.
Yes. Give me the techniques. I'm ready.
Well, she starts in chapter 4 by talking about minimizing distractions. That might seem obvious, but how often do we let our phones or computers or even just background noise pull our attention away?
Oh, all the time. We're surrounded by distractions. I know I'm definitely guilty of checking my phone during conversations.
We all do it. But Laura has some really good tips on how to create a better listening environment, like silencing your phone, finding a quiet spot, or even just turning off the TV. Little things like that can make a big difference.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's about creating a space for focus.
Exactly. And she also talks about grounding yourself before conversations. Remember how we were talking about emotional reactivity?
Yeah.
Well, grounding techniques can help you calm your nervous system and be more present.
Okay, tell me more about that. What kind of grounding techniques does she recommend?
She shares a simple one in the book that I actually use a lot. It's called the 5-4-3-2-1 method.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Basically, you just bring your attention to your senses. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste.
Oh, wow. I never heard of that before, but I love it. It's like a mini meditation to bring you into the present moment.
It is, and it only takes a couple of minutes. Have you ever tried anything like that?
I've done some meditation, but I've never thought about using it to prepare for a conversation. That is a brilliant tip. I'm definitely going to try that.
I think you'll find it helpful. And then, of course, she talks about all those active listening techniques, making eye contact, nodding to show you're following along, asking clarifying questions.
Yes, those are all important reminders. It's so easy to slip into passive listening mode without even realizing it.
It is, especially when you're tired or distracted. But those active listening techniques really help signal to the speaker that you're engaged and interested.
And in chapter 5, she goes beyond words. She talks about the nonverbal cues, right?
Exactly. Tuning into those subtle signals that can often tell you more than words. Things like facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, they all give you valuable information about what the person is really feeling.
Oh, for sure. I remember reading somewhere that something like 93% of communication is nonverbal.
Yeah, it's a huge part of it. And it's not just about picking up on those cues in others. It's also about being aware of your own nonverbal communication. Are you sending signals that match your words? Or are you accidentally giving mixed messages?
That's a good point. I've never thought about it that way.
And one of the most powerful nonverbal tools that Laura highlights is the pause. That moment of silence that can feel a little awkward.
Oh, yeah, I hate those. I always feel like I have to fill them with something. But I bet she's saying we should embrace them.
You got it. Silence can be so powerful. It gives the speaker time to really process their thoughts. And it gives you, as the listener, time to absorb what they're saying without jumping in with a response.
I can see that. When I allow myself to sit with the silence, sometimes it's like deeper insights come up.
It's like giving the conversation room to breathe. And, sometimes those unspoken needs, validation, understanding, encouragement, they come to light in those quiet moments.
So it's not just about what's being said, but also what's not being said. That's deep.
It is. And it leads us into one of the most challenging but really important parts of intentional listening, navigating difficult conversations.
Ugh, yes. Those are never fun, but we all have to have them sometime. I'm guessing this is where chapter 6 comes in.
You got it. And she really breaks it down. She gives you a step-by-step guide to help you approach those tough conversations with more skill and confidence.
Okay, I'm ready for it. Lay it on me.
It starts with preparation. She emphasizes setting intentions for the conversation. What do you want to accomplish? What would be a good outcome?
That's a great place to start. I often go into those situations feeling anxious and unprepared, so having those clear intentions would be super helpful.
Absolutely. And she also talks about managing your emotional triggers. Remember, we talked about that earlier. It's especially crucial in difficult conversations. If you know you tend to get defensive when someone criticizes your work, for example, you can prepare yourself to stay calm and open.
Yeah, that's so important. It's like putting on your emotional armor before you walk into battle.
Exactly. And then once you're in the conversation, she emphasizes using open-ended questions to encourage the other person to share their perspective. Questions like, can you tell me more about that? Or what led you to feel that way?
So it's about shifting from being defensive to being genuinely curious.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful things you can do to de-escalate a conflict is to validate the other person's feelings. Even if you don't agree with them, it's about acknowledging their experience.
Can you give me an example of what that sounds like?
Sure. Imagine someone is expressing frustration about a project that didn't go well. Instead of saying, "Oh, I understand you're frustrated," which can sound kind of dismissive, try saying something like, "It sounds like you put a lot of effort into this, and it's understandable that you're disappointed with the outcome."
Oh, I see the difference.
Yes.
The second one really acknowledges their feelings. It's not about trying to fix them. It's about just validating their experience.
Exactly. And once everyone feels heard and validated, then you can start to collaborate on solutions. It's amazing how much easier those conversations become when you approach them that way.
I can imagine. This is all so helpful. And, I'm realizing that these principles can be applied not just in personal relationships, but also in professional settings.
You're so right. And in chapters 7 through 9, Laura explores all those different applications, professional settings, personal relationships, and even the often neglected practice of listening to ourselves.
Oh, listening to ourselves. That's intriguing. Tell me more.
She makes the point that self-listening is the foundation of intentional listening. You can't truly show up for others if you haven't learned to listen to your own inner voice, your thoughts, your feelings, your needs, your intuition.
Wow, that's a good point. It's like that saying about putting on your own oxygen mask first before helping others.
That's a perfect analogy. And she has some really great exercises and journal prompts to help you cultivate that self-awareness.
This is all so insightful. It's like intentional listening is about so much more than just communication. It's about personal growth, building stronger relationships, creating a more compassionate world.
Exactly. You're getting it. And in part 3 of the book, she takes it even further. She talks about building a culture of listening.
Oh, wow. That sounds like she's moving beyond individual skills to something much bigger, like a collective transformation.
Exactly. It's about creating a ripple effect where intentional listening becomes the norm, not the exception.
Okay, I am definitely ready to hear more about that. This conversation is blowing my mind already.
Me too. It's really inspiring stuff.
So we're talking about this idea of intentional listening becoming like a cultural shift.
Hmm.
It's not just about individual skills anymore. It's something bigger.
Right. And that's really the focus of part 3. Laura is looking at the impact of listening on a much wider scale.
And in chapter 11, she talks about building a culture of listening. What does that even look like?
Well, it starts with recognizing that listening is more than just taking in information. It's about creating space for everyone to feel heard, respected, and valued. It's moving away from the "I need to be right" mentality and toward the "I want to understand" mentality.
That's a pretty big shift. It's like moving from competition to collaboration.
Exactly. And she argues that this is super important for tackling a lot of the problems we face today on a personal level and on a societal level.
So how does that work?
Well, she talks about how a culture of listening can give a voice to communities that are often marginalized. It can help people with different viewpoints actually have a dialogue. And it can even help us find solutions to big issues like inequality and climate change.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. It makes me think about how often we try to solve problems without really listening to the people who are most affected by them.
Yeah, it happens all the time. And Laura gives some really inspiring examples of people and organizations that are using listening to create positive change. There's a story about a community leader who used listening circles to bring together police officers and residents in a neighborhood that was experiencing a lot of tension.
That's amazing. It shows how listening can help to heal and rebuild trust.
Exactly. And she also talks about how listening is essential for fostering creativity and innovation. When people feel like they're being heard, they're more willing to share their ideas. And that can lead to breakthroughs that wouldn't have been possible otherwise.
That makes sense. It's like creating fertile ground for new ideas to sprout.
Exactly. And this all ties back to something we talked about before, the importance of listening to ourselves.
Right. Self-listening is like the foundation for creating a culture of listening.
That's a beautiful way to put it. If we can't listen to our own inner voice, how can we possibly listen to others?
And I imagine this is even more challenging in the digital age, with all the information overload and distractions.
Hmm.
That's something Laura addresses in chapter 14, right?
Yes. She really gets into the challenges and opportunities of listening in a world that's dominated by technology. She talks about how social media can sometimes make it harder to connect on a deeper level. There's just so much noise.
It can feel overwhelming for sure.
It can, but she also sees the potential for technology to enhance our listening, like connecting with people from different cultures or using video calls to have more meaningful conversations.
So it's all about using technology mindfully as a tool to support intentional listening rather than as a barrier.
Exactly. And it requires us to be more intentional and focused in our listening efforts. We have to make choices about what we consume, who we interact with, and how we manage those digital distractions.
We have to be the protectors of our own attention.
That's a great way to put it. And in the end, Laura's message is one of hope and empowerment. She believes that intentional listening is a skill that anyone can learn and develop, and it can transform our lives, our relationships, our communities, and ultimately the world.
It's such an inspiring message, and it really resonates with the whole purpose of these deep dives, to give you the tools and knowledge to make a positive difference.
And she leaves us with a powerful thought in the reflection section of the book. Listening isn't a destination, it's a lifelong journey. Every conversation is an invitation to connect, learn, and grow.
So beautiful. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember?
I hope they feel inspired to make intentional listening a part of their daily lives. It takes effort, but it's so worth it.
Absolutely. And don't forget, The Practice of Intentional Listening by Laura Lewonder is out tomorrow on Amazon. It's full of practical strategies, journaling prompts, and exercises to help you become a more powerful and compassionate listener.
It's a game changer, that's for sure. Don't miss this opportunity to improve your relationships, boost your communication skills, and strengthen your connection with yourself and the people around you.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the world of intentional listening. We hope you found it insightful and inspiring. Remember, you have the power to make a difference, one conversation at a time.
Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep connecting.